One iconic feature of the Resident Evil games is the use of stalker enemies. Since the second game that was released back in the 90s, all the way up to the newest entry of the franchise, stalker enemies have always added a new level of fear that you just couldn't blast your way through like you could with other enemies. And after looking back at every Resident Evil game, it seems that there's 10 stalker enemies in total. So on today's episode of Nerdspace Games, I'll be diving down into those 10 stalker enemies as I rank them from worst to best. Before that though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content I bring you guys. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But with that out of the way, this is Nerdspace Games with every stalker enemy in Resident Evil ranked from worst to best. Let's get it. Number 10, Lisa Trevor, Resident Evil Remake. Because of the very limited encounters that the player has with Lisa Trevor, it's kind of hard to consider her a stalker enemy. However, when you think about what qualifies as a stalker enemy in Resident Evil, then for the most part, Lisa Trevor fits that bill. Stalker enemies tend to be indestructible monsters that you just can't kill for good. Instead, you either run away from them, or when they appear, you fire enough ammunition into them to put them down for a brief moment. Lisa Trevor appears in the game 3 times, with 2 of them being impossible to fully kill her, once in a cabin where she has you cornered and the other in the underground tunnels. Between the sound of chains dragging as she moves closer to you and her terrifying moaning, Lisa Trevor will make you feel anxiety each time she pops up. Since you can't kill her in your first 2 encounters with her, your only option is to run like hell and avoid her attacks. While being very creepy, Lisa Trevor barely pops up in the game, and even when she does, it's in small areas where she'll move very slowly. So unfortunately, that puts her at the bottom of today's list. Number 9, Chief Mendez, Separate Ways. In both the original game and the remake, Chief Mendez didn't really do enough to be considered a stalker enemy in Resident Evil 4. However, due to his size and posture, he would have made a very good stalker enemy considering that he had a lot of similarities to Mr. X. So it wasn't too surprising to find out that the remake of the Separate Ways DLC decided to make good use of those similarities by making him a stalker enemy for a small section in the village. Granted, that section was very small and it was pretty easy to avoid him thanks to Ada's grappling gun. Still, his intimidating size was enough to give me Mr. X flashbacks to the point where I found myself never looking back until I completely escaped the village and ran into the next cutscene. Because Mendez had the potential to be a really good stalker enemy, but ultimately Capcom chose not to explore this aspect a little more, we instead find him as number 9 on this list. Number 8, Axeman, Resident Evil Outbreak. Because he appears in a spin-off game that was never released again after its initial release on the PlayStation 2, Axeman is probably the least recognizable stalker enemy of the franchise. Appearing in the flashback scenario of Resident Evil Outbreak files, Axeman is basically a human who's been enhanced with a T-virus infected plant, because he believes that the plant that infected him is some sort of resurrected form of his late wife. The Axeman hunts down any survivors he finds within the abandoned hospital to then feed them to his plant. So throughout the scenario, he'll pop up at random times and stalk the players throughout the halls of this creepy hospital. While he's not as terrifying as some of the more iconic stalker enemies of the franchise, he's still a pretty awesome stalker enemy considering that he's consistently chasing not 1, but 3 players throughout the scenario. And his random encounters will catch you off guard and at most times lead you to panicking as he runs after you with his massive axe. Number 7, Ustanak, Resident Evil 6. Ustanak is a stalker enemy that only appears in Jake's campaign of Resident Evil 6. I'll be completely honest, I wasn't a huge fan of his during my very first playthrough of this game. I found most of his appearances to be annoying and some of my least favorite stages of the game included him in it. But after replaying RE6 recently, I think I was a little hard on this guy. Sure, he's not the most iconic or scariest stalker enemy when you compare him to every other monster above him on this list, but he's persistent and Capcom came up with some pretty creative ways of dealing with him during the multiple encounters in Resident Evil 6. From playing hide and seek with him essentially to running like hell from him to then eventually going Bruce Lee on his ass, Ustanak presents a lot of unique encounters with him that are not seen anywhere else outside of Jake's campaign in Resident Evil 6. Plus his mechanical arm and speed gave him a lot more mobility than we're used to when it comes to stalker enemies. Number 6, Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Remake. You know, I'm not gonna lie, when Resident Evil 3 Remake was first announced, I seriously thought we were going to see the best stalker enemy ever in this game. Yet, here we are with him not even cracking the top 5 best stalker enemies of Resident Evil. That's kinda sad. I mean, say it with me, Nemesis from Resident Evil 3 Remake is not in the top 5 stalker enemies of the franchise. Like, what? On paper, this should have been a home run. Nemesis is known for being one of the most iconic stalker enemies in video games. Yet, Capcom kinda shit the bed here with him. Sure, he's always been scripted, but in Resident Evil 3 Remake, most of those scripted moments were in the form of cutscenes and boss fights. What really made OG Nemesis and other stalker enemies of the franchise iconic were the non-cinematic entrances that they had. Plus, outside of a brief section with the streets of Raccoon City, Nemesis didn't really feel like a true stalker enemy. Instead, it felt like a reoccurring boss fight, kind of similar to William Birkin in Resident Evil 2, but with a small sample from Mr. X. Still, his presence in the streets of Raccoon City, his speed and arsenal, and the menacing look he gave us while we hid out in the toy store was enough to earn him number 6 on this list. Number 5, Mr. X, Resident Evil 2. I feel like a lot of you guys might not be happy to see the original Mr. X solo on this list, but after recently replaying the original game, I started to realize why Mr. X wasn't an iconic stalker enemy until the remake came along. While his size and look were intimidating, he never really posed a true threat to the player in the original game. Most of his encounters were brief, and a lot of the time, all you had to do in order to avoid him was walk through the nearest door. On top of that, he's slow as hell compared to other stalker enemies in the franchise. Yeah, him walking as he followed you was kinda creepy the first couple of times you ran into him, but when you compare him to the likes of Nemesis who bolted towards you, this version of Mr. X just didn't do a great job at intimidating you throughout the game. Still, there were a few things that this Mr. X got right, and therefore earned him a higher spot on this list compared to other stalker enemies. As already addressed earlier, his signature look was very intimidating, and even though his walk ultimately made it hard for him to ever pose a real threat, it offered him a creepy aesthetic to his design. Finally, because he only appeared in Scenario B, players were completely caught off guard when he made his entrance, and the scene of him getting back up after defeating him in the hall scared a lot of us in our first playthrough as kids back in the 90s. And let's not forget about him punching his way through the press room and into the hallway of the RPD station. He definitely got me a few times. So he at least deserves some credit for being scarier than the remake version of Nemesis, hence why he earns a spot as number 5. Number 4, Lady Dimitrescu, Resident Evil Village. Out of all of the stalker enemies that cracked the top 5, we've probably spent the least amount of time with Lady D. Yet, the little time that we spent with Lady D chasing after us with her long-ass claws were enough to earn her a spot as number 4 on this list. The most important trait on Lady D that really made her stand out was her beautiful size. Because she made Mr. X look like a child in comparison to her size, Lady D instantly became that much more intimidating. Plus, something about her sinister smile and demeanor as she followed you around her castle just elevated that fear of her. Let's not forget her evil taunting, as unlike most stalker enemies, Lady D actually spoke to Ethan as she chased him throughout the halls. And even though she walks like Mr. X does, she does so at a pace that'll surprise you how fast she can catch up to you. On Village of Shadows difficulty, she deals a massive amount of damage and almost instantly kills you each time she reaches you. So in that mode, she's even more terrifying with you knowing the consequences of letting her catch you. Add that to the fact that she also cuts off Ethan's hand, again, and you'll instantly regret ending up in her castle. The only complaint I have about her is the fact that we didn't get more time with her chasing us throughout the village. Not that I wanted her to catch me or anything, of course. Number 3, Jack Baker, Resident Evil 7. Lady D might have been one of the only stalker enemies to talk to the player as she chased them, but she wasn't the first, nor was she the best at it. Jack Baker, on the other hand, was terrifying as he spoke to you throughout the chase scenes with him. Just like Lady D, Jack Baker chose to walk after Ethan, but he did so at a much faster pace than you would expect for someone of his age. Because of how fast he walked, unless you were sprinting, Jack would easily catch up to you, and he would definitely make you pay for being caught by him. Also, unlike Lady D, Jack Baker actually spends most of the first half of the game chasing after Ethan. Considering that most of this section of the game took place in the Baker's main house, until you defeated Jack in the basement, you will continuously run into him again and again. Actually, this is even more so the case if you're playing on Madhouse, which adds more of Jack Baker throughout the Baker's main house, including a terrifying jump scare from him as you are about to leave the upstairs bathroom. As I said earlier, Jack loves taunting, and something about the things he says and his hillbilly accent just makes my skin crawl every time I hear him speak from behind me. Oh, and I forgot to mention this with Lady D, but first person perspective actually really helped elevate the fear of a stalker enemy. Because you're not able to run one direction while looking back behind you like you could with third person perspective, I found myself running as fast as I could while hearing Jack's voice behind me. But because I knew that the only way I could see how far behind me he was would be for me to stop and turn around, I was too afraid to look and instead was forced to listen to his footsteps until I couldn't hear them behind me anymore. This sometimes led to me being caught off guard when I thought he was gone, only to then turn around and be met with his fucking shovel to my face. Number 2, Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And here we are, the most iconic stalker enemy in video games, Nemesis. Now I know it might be a little shocking to see him here at number 2 instead of number 1, but I'll get to that later when we talk about the number 1 entry. Instead, let's talk about why Nemesis from the original Resident Evil 3 is one of the best stalker enemies ever created. As I mentioned when we were discussing the remake's version of Nemesis, the original version of him felt more random. Sure, they were scripted just like most encounters with stalker enemies are, but the original Nemesis always made it feel a little more random since he didn't always appear in cutscenes. At times, you may just walk through a door and the next thing you know, you'll hear a gate open and close and then there's Nemesis bolting towards you as fast as possible. Plus, his iconic stars line has lived on with us throughout all of these years. Then, looking at his arsenal and abilities, it's clear to see that he's the most dangerous stalker enemy. From being able to shoot you with a rocket launcher or flamethrower to having the ability to race across the map faster than Jill can run, Nemesis really is the most dangerous stalker enemy in Resident Evil. Oh, and did I mention that he has one of the best jump scares in this series? So between his scare factor, his arsenal, his speed, his iconic voice as he says stars, and the randomness of when and where he appears, Nemesis from the original Resident Evil 3 claims the title for second best stalker enemy in Resident Evil. But oh, who I wonder claims the number 1 spot? Let's find out. The title of Best Stalker in Resident Evil goes to Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Listen, I get that Nemesis from the original game is the most iconic and probably the most memorable. Hell, I can see why a lot of you would probably put him as number 1 on this list. But when you take everything into account as to what makes a good stalker enemy, then you'll find that Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 Remake makes a stronger case for being number 1 on this list. Starting with the fear factor. While Nemesis from the original RE3 and Mr. X from RE2 Remake both pop up at random points without the need of a cutscene, I feel like Mr. X is a little more intimidating. Sure, he doesn't have the use of a rocket launcher or a flamethrower, but to be completely honest, something about him chasing you down with his bare hands is terrifying. Plus, watching his tall ass squeeze into rooms is fucking horrifying too. He has a lot of jump scares, including some that even compete with the window scene in the original Resident Evil 3. Neither one of these monsters can be put down for good until a certain point in the game, but Mr. X gets up mere moments after you put him down. Plus, his death stance of just taking a knee is pretty unnerving. However, my favorite part about Mr. X, and a big reason as to why I think he makes a stronger stalker enemy than OG Nemesis, comes from the fact that you can hear him roaming around the RPD. Since there's no load screens when you open doors, this makes the whole setting of the RPD that much more terrifying when dealing with Mr. X. For example, if he's 1 floor above you or in the next room, you can hear his loud ass footsteps as he grows closer or farther away from you. And when you do end up coming face to face with him, you get a killer soundtrack that will fill you with adrenaline as you begin the ultimate chase sequence. Overall, Mr. X just had me sweating more than Nemesis ever did from the original game. And maybe that's just a personal opinion, but one that I 100% stand by. So for me, Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 Remake claims the title of Best Stalker Enemy of the franchise.
Sherry, come on!
But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my number 1 choice. Is Mr. X from RE2 Remake the best stalker enemy in Resident Evil, or do you think Nemesis or even Jack Baker deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.